To the programme with you until 10:15, and then morning service will be on the air. Well, religious leaders around the world, including the Pope, called for prayers as the people of Ukraine came under attack from Russian air fire and artillery. What purpose does prayer provide? Does it allow the millions of us not directly affected by the war to feel like we're doing something to help? What is the evidence of prayer having a role in peace building? Well, I've been discussing this with Dr. Gladys Ganiel from the School of Sciences, Social Sciences at Queen's University, and to Michael Nugent of Atheist Ireland. First, Dr. Ganiel.
Well, I would look at this from a social scientific point of view because I'm a sociologist. And from this perspective, you can point to social effects of prayer. So if you want to call that prayer working, yes, I think you can. In terms of the way that people perceive their prayers as having an effect in the real world. So if prayer inspires somebody to action, to help someone, and that helps to improve a situation, I think that is some evidence of the power of prayer in the world. What you can't do is say that that was prompted by God, in an empirical way. But certainly I think you can make the argument that, yes, prayer does have a social effect. It has a political effect.
And just elaborate on what that social and political effects can be at times.
Well, I think there are a number of ways. So, for instance, people of faith, and in my own research, I have encountered this. They have talked of the power of prayer, prompting them to change the way they think about their religious identity, maybe moving from something more extreme to something more moderate. So reaching out to people of other religions as a result of what they perceive as prayer being prompted by the Spirit to change. And also, I think prayer is very important for activists from a faith perspective in terms of helping them to cope with adversity. So as we know, peace building or dealing with conflict is a difficult long-term process. So in order for people to remain engaged in that and engaged in grassroots peace building work over many, many years, they need to sustain their hope. And engaging in regular acts of prayer, both individually and with groups, I think helps people to do that. It encourages them. It is a way of coping, I think.
Michael, what are your thoughts on this, on the purpose of prayer and the impact of prayer at a time of great international crisis, or indeed any crisis in our lives?
Well, I think the first thing to be absolutely clear about is that praying does not cause the creator of the universe to intervene in the laws of nature or to get people to behave in certain ways. There's no evidence that that happens, and there's reliable evidence that it doesn't happen in terms of scientific studies. The most comprehensive was about 20 years ago, maybe, when the Templeton Foundation funded a study, a lengthy study and a multi-million-dollar study of people who were recovering from heart operations. And some of them were prayed for, some of them weren't prayed for, some of them knew that they were being prayed for, some of them didn't know whether they were being prayed for. And that study found that there was no difference at all whether you were prayed for in terms of complications during surgery. It also found that if you knew you were being prayed for, you had slightly greater chance of complications in surgery. So if anything, it could be slightly counterproductive. So that's the first thing. The second thing, which I agree with, is that it can have an impact on how you behave. And if it helps how you behave in a positive way, then it can have an indirect effect. But that's not because it's prayer. If you look at positive psychology and the findings of positive psychology on what enhances personal well-being, there's three main things. One is relationships with other people, which could be personal or communal. The second is absorption in activities that you're doing for their own sake. So, and that could be things, it could be anything from music or running or meditation or prayer or anything of that nature. And the third is a sense of meaning, which you can get through philosophy or voluntary activity or through religion. So prayer is one way of getting those benefits, but it's not because it's prayer. It's because it fits into one or other of those benefits. And that can give you hope, that can give you consolation, and it can, in some situations, give you the motivation to do actual activity that could affect the outside world. But that would be the cause and effect. It wouldn't be that it's anything to do with supernatural forces.
What do you think of that, Gladys?
Well, as a social scientist, we bracket the question when we're thinking about this, whether God intervenes in the world. It's not really a social scientific question. So fundamentally, listening to Michael, I think there's a great deal of agreement in, what I would believe as a social scientist and what the identity or what the evidence tells me from studying people of faith who are engaging in conflict or in peace building as well. But I mean, I think that we have to respect the personal identities of peace builders. And if people perceive prayer, if they perceive the presence of God, we have to honor that as, their perspective. But I don't see that it necessarily has to be an exclusive perspective either. So I think in terms of what Michael says, the effects of prayer in the real world, there's fundamentally quite a bit of agreement in our perspectives, really.
Michael, take this current war, for example, in Ukraine. Many of us this far removed feel powerless, feel helpless, feel very inadequate. And perhaps praying for many of us is all we can do to feel we're contributing or doing something. Is that fair enough?
It could well be in terms of something that's a far distance away that you can't directly influence. But if we bring it back closer to here in terms of the Northern Ireland conflict that was going on for so many years here, and I was involved in various groups that campaigned against terrorism on both sides in Northern Ireland there. And we thought in the Republic, when we were campaigning on that, we initially thought that people in the Republic were apathetic or indifferent to the murders that were going on in Northern Ireland. But as things went on, we began to feel that we were mistaken about that. And that what was happening was that people felt hopeless and helpless, and that was manifesting itself as if it was apathy and indifference. And then we found that during the campaign, certainly in the Republic, and also in more directly in Northern Ireland, that anything that could get people to feel less helpless, and prayer would have been one of those things, but secular activities will be others, can motivate people to get involved if they think that they can make a difference. If prayer motivates you, say if you take the Ukraine situation at the moment, if prayer motivates you to lobby politicians or collect money for donations for refugees or to do something positive that actually helps the situation, then it can be helpful.
Well, that's interesting, Gladys, because this is something that you have studied as well. And of course, in relation to the conflict here and the peace process here, churches, individuals within churches, of course, contributed to that process. Is there any evidence that their praying had a substantial role in peace building efforts here?
I certainly think so. And it reminds me of a phrase that Linda Woodhead, a sociologist, used about prayer. She talked about prayer as changing the subject. And this works in two ways. So the first way, it changes the subject by changing you as an individual person. It changes the way you think about the world or provides some hope or solace, similar to the way the examples Michael was giving there of people in the Republic of Ireland. But then there's also the evidence of prayer as changing the subject and perhaps giving people new ideas of how to create initiatives in the real world. I wrote a biography of Father Jerry Reynolds, and one of the real world initiatives that he created, which he perceived as coming from prayer, from the Holy Spirit, was the Unity Pilgrims Initiative, where, a group of Catholic parishioners would have visited Protestant congregations every Sunday to come alongside them and worship and so forth. And on Remembrance Sunday in 1994, he felt, God spoke to him in prayer to go and visit a congregation on the Shankill. And, there are other examples like that. One of the archbishops in Uganda sets aside the entire day on a Thursday just to pray, as he feels that that's where he gets his creative energy to go and to advocate for peace building in that context as well.
So, Michael, does it make them feel they're being more effective in what they do when it comes to peace building or bringing communities together?
I think it's not the right way to frame it as prayer doing it. It's anything that gives you that sense of either absorption or sense of meaning or relations with other people, whether it's religious or secular, can help you to do that. Atheist Ireland works alongside the Evangelical Alliance of Ireland and the Ahmadi Muslim community of Ireland on a lot of issues in terms of separation of church and state and human rights issues. And we have obviously very different worldviews. Atheist Ireland members wouldn't think that prayer affects anything directly, whereas Ahmadis and evangelicals would. But we can work together on the practical issues. And I think that's the important thing, regardless of where we get our motivation. But what I do think is very dangerous if religious leaders create the impression prayer directly benefits people, because there's no evidence that happens and a lot of evidence that there does. I mean, one of the more dangerous ones, I think, is people being encouraged, particularly vulnerable and ill people, being encouraged to travel to Lourdes, where there's about one cure for every 3 million pilgrims. You have a better chance of dying than being cured at Lourdes. There are things like that I do think are actively dangerous to people if you fetishize the idea that prayer can directly help people as opposed to indirectly motivate you to doing things.
From your work, Gladys, how does the role of prayer Is there a difference between prayer engaged in by lay people and those who are ordained?
Well, there hasn't actually been a lot of research on the role of prayer in faith and peace building. And I wrote an academic article recently pointing that out. It's an understudied subject. Although one interesting hypothesis that I think merits further exploration is that lay women are quite often leaders in prayer at grassroots, at community levels. So from a social point of view, that may be a place or an activity where women of faith are showing some leadership, but actually perhaps not being recognized for it. And, leading prayer groups, leading prayer initiatives and inspiring activism in that way. But really, it's an area that needs a lot more research in the social sciences.
Thanks to Dr. Gladys Ganiel and to Michael Nugent for taking part. And thank you for listening to us this morning. Thanks to our team, producer Seamus Boyd, Megan Wilson, and all of us here. We'll be back at